office manager or supervisor can set the stage and set the tone, but everybody has a responsibility to make that work. And we can't say, well, it didn't work because of supervisor. I mean, it didn't work because all of us weren't involved.
I think that minimizes it,
Okay.
depending upon the supervisor's actions.
All right.
It's not going to eliminate all of the subtle discrimination that occurs in a department, but I think it will minimize it.
Okay. Fine. So you're
Minimize it.
saying that the person in charge has a major responsibility to set the tone.
Under the law, the person in charge is responsible for maintaining an atmosphere that's free of racial, sexual, religious, and other discriminatory overtones. And if that person gives the impression that this person is not really wanted but has to be there, I think that person is the one who is responsible for the attitudes of the employees in that unit.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Thank you. We have another question that's been phoned in from northern Iowa. A quote in the newspaper said, "Although the boys didn't win, they represented our community well." It went on to say that the Sunday winner was a Vietnamese boy who was playing the piano, and the second place winner went to a Negro boy singing Old Man River. The question is this appropriate in terms of a news story to dwell on the race of the participants who did win? Who wants to tackle that?
I'll tackle it because I tackle those questions all the time. When we take a look at the media and when we talk about how stereotypes develop and how images develop, the media plays a very important part, because when you see either advertisements or you see commercials or whatever, you see certain types of people always in the same types of settings. When we look at the media, we make sure that if they are going to refer to a group, to a racial group, that is consistently done. Okay, if it's if the media consistently says Vietnamese, African American, Caucasian, or whatever, if that's a consistent thing, that's the way they operate. But if they only talk about Vietnamese in criminal situations, or make reference to race or gender in specific situations, that sends up alarms in my book. And that's when I feel I have the responsibility, or my staff, to contact that media group to ask them, why are they taking this approach? Why in only specific situations do they make note of someone's either disability or gender or race or national origin? So that's how I would respond to that.
On top of that, too, I think that's part of that condescending thing. It's almost as if it implies that it's really surprising that this Vietnamese boy or this black youngster could do this. And the same thing happens with disabled persons all the time. It's almost as if saying, we really didn't expect them to be able to achieve at this level.
I'm not sure I understood the question. What was the question again? In what context?
The question was, in the newspaper story, was it appropriate to signal out the Vietnamese boy who won, and the black boy who sang Old Man River?
Was it some kind of talent contest?
Yes, evidently.
Okay.
So saying that the local community members did not win but represented the community well, and the winners were, and then described them by using race or origin.
I would have hoped they used their names also,
I don't know.
instead of just the descriptive phrase. I think that would be an insult to not use their names, period, no matter who they were.
Okay, that's interesting. All right. I have a question for you, Jan.
Okay.
Came to us from Northeast Iowa. Does a housing property owner have a right to select or reject based on the moral standards obviously different from the neighborhood?
From the neighborhood. This is marital status. And Iowa law and federal law do not protect marital status at this time. Iowa City does. So it's a little, you must always look at The federal law must be matched by state laws must be matched by local laws. Anyone can add to the protected list whatever they want to. Now, my personal opinion is, isn't it terrible that we have to make laws that say, I'm going to be nice to you. You're female, you're older, you might be disabled, whatever. The list is going to get so long, and we know this because you read the newspaper, and there's always another big flap in another city. Are we going to protect the homosexuals or not? Well, marital status is not now protected, but how much better to go back to the application and checking references and picking a stable relationship instead of having to have a piece of paper that says this couple is married. Now, no one has to rent to someone who has a history of destruction or disruption. Anyone with a stable relationship is not going to be disrupting the neighborhood. Other kinds of relationships or practices would disrupt. You would not have to rent under those circumstances. Now, I have a daughter who was married to a horrible boy who beat her in 3 states in rental property. But they had that piece of paper that said they were a married couple. Now, when would she be a better tenant? In a stable relationship. So, marital status does not guarantee a stable, reliable tenant. How much better again?
How did you signal in on that being marital status in that question? I read that and I thought, well...
I have been on the road for a year and a half in the state of Iowa. Let me ask you, lady, what about people living together without marriage? Well, I got started saying, parents cannot legislate the morality or lack of morality of their children. Why should you, sir, ma'am, think you should be able to legislate the morality or lack of your tenants? Doesn't make sense, does it?
Okay.
And people say, but it's my property. Yes, you want to protect your property, you want to protect your investment. Check references. That's the only way you're going to be assured, to a certain degree, of a desirable tenant.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I think that most of the laws that apply to housing, I think, covers certain types of housing, whether the owner lives in the houses, how many units do you have. I think the issue becomes whose moral standards are you judging? Is it for one group as opposed to another? Do you look at the moral standards only of a different race or a different sex or a different religion? And I think that's when it becomes possibly discriminatory and therefore becomes in violation of the law. Now, if you're doing this on all people, I'm not so sure the law would cover that. If you're doing it only for some people, yes, it could be.
That's right.
And when a minority comes there and you do that on that basis, then that person is going to file a complaint. The only way you can find out if this is discriminatory is to check to see how you do other people.
Okay.
This is what I started to allude to, and the children. When Congress passed the amendment to add protections to families with children, when I couldn't understand why are people so hysterical about renting to children? Well, I think that a lot of racial discrimination was practiced under the guise of we don't rent to some families with children, and when you no longer can automatically deny because of children, people were very excited because then we have to rent to all those kinds of people. And once we get to know each other, we don't look at we don't see these differences if we know each other. But we have to live together to know each other, and we're just going around in circles.
Okay. We have another question called in from Northwest Iowa. Is it against the rules to have a program? Okay. This goes back to program again. Is it against the rules to have a program called Lady Landowners, targeted to widows who are now forced into taking care of the financial operation of the farm? Sometimes these women feel freer to ask questions without men present. This is a targeted audience again, which goes back to the other question. Anybody want to say anything about that?
Is this a program that is offered through your services? As long as that program is open and accessible to anyone, because I assume that some men may want to sit in and to learn. Like I said, I don't know if we have problems with the fact that they're targeting a particular audience. I think we do that a lot of times. When we develop educational programs, we think of an audience that we have in mind, and so we gear our thoughts and our message towards that audience. But as long as you do not prevent males from coming in and attending that, I don't see that as a problem.
I think the other thing to consider in relation to that is that in each of our program areas in Co-op Extension, we have set some targets for reaching the number of men and women that we need to reach in terms of making our program accessible in terms of gender. And in the agricultural program, I think they say that they will try to have an audience of about 30% women, 70% men. So this could be viewed as an affirmative action on the part of an ag program if they were trying to make that program more accessible and more comfortable for women to participate.
But one other suggestion I may have is that you can always change the name and provide information that will benefit everyone, and make sure that when you do the publicity, that you communicate that this information will help different types of people, and that may be another approach. So you won't have this name per se that is only targeted to one audience.
You could say newly responsible landowners or recently acquired property landowners. There'd just be a lot of better terminologies to use.
Well, I think that most of the programs are tailored to a specific audience. I know we have programs for minorities, we have programs for women. I think the issue is whether others are excluded.
Yeah.
I don't think the name necessarily has to be changed. I think the issue is whether other people are kept out of it. And I find nothing wrong with having that for the, what was that, the women?
Lady landowners.
Lady landowner,
Yeah.
that may be a special problem that they have and a need for special information because they have not been included in the normal programming for other landowners.
You know, I object to the term lady, but you have to find something to use.
Can I ask
So
a question?
you may.
All right, what about ladies' nights in bars?
Well, I think
We
the
don't have a
law-
program on that.
No, but I mean, is this discrimination?
It's
Oh, it
not
is now.
Had
It
been
is
found
now.
to be.
Yeah. Well, it always has been. The Iowa Supreme Court did recently, if you look at, there was the Council Bluffs, was it Council Bluffs Greyhound? Do they have
Track.
a Greyhound track?
Yes, yes.
They had a ladies' night where the women would have reduced rates in entrance and fees into the racetrack. And the Iowa Supreme Court recently did rule that that was discrimination. So technically, just for people's information, the discounted drinks, ladies' night at the bars, or men's night, or whatever, that technically is illegal.
So how about senior citizens rates for meals?
Okay, in public accommodations, age is not a basis.
Okay, so you can give discounts.
That's right.
But under federal law, age affirmative action programs can be taken for the aging. So it's permitted in some cases, but it's not required. So in that case, it is not a violation.
And
I think the issue here with the bars, the ladies' nights, was it's an absolute bar. And whenever you have that, that's when you're bordering on discrimination.
See, wouldn't it be nicer if we just did everything the same for everybody all the time?
I don't think everything has to be the same for everybody all the time. I think that there are special needs of special groups that you have to do. Assuming that everyone is on an equal level, then everything could be equal, but that's not the way society is.
All right, but I still don't like the fact that we make lists and we make exceptions under these conditions, and it just gets so confusing. It's like the 3 laws in fair housing. 601A Iowa, Title 8 federal, pages. Then they make exceptions basis race in the 60s because nice white people didn't want to live next door to nice black people. If you meet these conditions, you do not have to make your housing available to people of different races. Overruled by one 20-word sentence, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which says all citizens shall be treated the same in property. Isn't that much easier?
1866.
1866. This law was passed after the Civil War to allow black people to buy land for the first time, which had been denied them. In 1968, interpreted land to include housing. And we don't need all these pages of law. Everybody can understand that one sentence.
I'm sure that there'd be a lot of people who would agree with you, and yet we know that that's not the way the world operates, and so then we get forced into the other kinds of actions. I think the point that Charles made was reinforced for me yesterday when I got the announcement of the Way Up conference, which Iowa University's sponsor for women who are wanting to know more about administrative leadership kinds of jobs. That conference has been going on now for probably 8 or 10 years.
But it's not only for women.
No, that's
right.
right. When you look at the program, much of it would be relevant, and many of the speakers are men who have special expertise to share. And there are certainly men who are at that program as full-time attendees. But it's an effort on the part of the universities to say, we are taking some affirmative action in terms of program. Agreed?
I agree, yes.
All right, fine. I have another question which sort of piggybacks on that, I think. When the politics of our organization covertly discriminate against women for leadership positions, what recourse does the woman have?
It's a difficult question when you have no specifics. I don't know what you mean when the politics prevent them. If it's discrimination, it's not political. So it's very difficult to answer on the basis of
Okay.
politics, and we'd have to deal with it on the basis of in what way are women discriminated against.
Let's use an example and see if that will help. There is an opportunity for naming a new office chair or county director in a county. A woman feels that she was not considered for that position. What is her recourse in
She
that?
can file a complaint with our office and with some of the agencies that I've indicated.
Okay.
But the issue here, I think what you try to do is no one is required to file a complaint with our office before going externally. They have that option, but they have no requirement. And what you would do in there is to look at the facts in the case. I think we would look at the facts. If it were filed with Iowa Civil Rights, they're going to look at the facts. And I think what people have to understand that neither of us is that person's advocate particularly. We're not their attorney, so you're looking at the facts. And if the facts supports her allegation, then it's not politics, it's discrimination.
Okay, okay.
I think that question kind of implies also an attitudinal bent toward people, the Good Old Boy Network, but I think you were explaining earlier today about some of the experiences you had in some of the smaller communities where that one that you just went to and the realtor board, and you might share that because I think that implies what that question was really asking, the kind of thing that you encountered on that.
When I visited a small town board of realtors, and the mayor, it was not a county seat community, and the mayor had asked me to come back to his community, and then he had to take an aunt to the hospital, so he wasn't there. Well, the next time I saw him, I said, "Sir, I know why you wanted me to come to your board of realtors meeting." The majority of the realtors were male. I was treated very condescendingly, that this really wasn't our idea, and it's a big joke, you know, ha ha. And they told jokes that I did not appreciate listening to. The gentleman introduced me, and they didn't pay much attention to me. "We aren't going to listen to you. We aren't interested. We know all about fair housing." And then I started in, and I told all my jokes about my problems with men and the vehicle. And they kind of started listening and getting their dander up, and I thought, well, they had been telling jokes about women to me. What difference does it make? And the gentleman across the table that had introduced me said, "I thought you were such a nice girl." And I said, "That was your first mistake. I haven't been a girl for a long time." Then we kind of had the air cleared and went on with the program. It was a difficult evening because they were so terribly sexist. Women just don't count in that community.
You made another comment before we came on the air, which I thought was interesting, Jan. You said that you'd rather have a vocal audience than a reticent audience.
Well, I would rather argue. Personally, I'd rather argue. I'd rather fight than be ignored. And it was a lot more fun the larger groups, when everybody did react and respond, at least I knew they were listening to me.
Okay.
Then the ones where you would be with 3 or 4 people and you could just see the anger in their faces, but because everybody knew them, they weren't going to say what they really thought.
All right, all right. Charles, did you have something you wanted to add to
No.
that? Okay. I think we have time for one more question, a very quick one perhaps. Can the lack of cooperation by staff members be considered subtle discrimination if you're the only minority in the office? Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I think if you are in an environment where your coworkers are not helpful and many times they thwart what you're trying to do, sure, that can be viewed as creating a workplace that, as Charles has described, you know, that you cannot function within it and you are prevented from doing your job. I think the manager has a responsibility to make sure that the workplace is free of this type of atmosphere of people doing underhanded things, and we know, you know, we've all experienced some of those things happening in our workplace. You know, the manager as well as the coworkers have some responsibility, and when you talk about harassment, some federal courts have found that coworkers also can be liable for harassment, either in sex discrimination cases or race discrimination cases. So everybody has that responsibility of making sure that the atmosphere is conducive to work.
Need an atmosphere in which we can be effective and productive.
Exactly.
And that's the responsibility of the total group, but certainly of the office supervisor or manager.
And we've experienced in some cases coming to our attention where people have been asked to put partitions around their desk because of their disability makes the other coworkers uncomfortable. And we've had to do some sensitivity training with other people. We've had the same thing in restaurants and other things. So I think it's it can be considered discrimination.
Yeah.
And the reasons may sound innocuous, but they aren't really.
And
They're
it's-
devastating.
Yeah, and it's really not very subtle when you
No,
come
it's
right
not.
down to it.
No, it isn't.
That's right.
If
And
you're
some-
if doing your job depends upon the cooperation of others, where they're supposed to train you and fail to do so, and then you take action because the person is not performing, in all probability you're going to lose that case.
Okay, very good. I think we are about ready for another quick break. We're going to give you a chance to call in questions to us. We're going to give the studio audience one more chance to develop a couple of questions and share with us. So call your questions in to 1-800-747-5505. Use that number and there'll be somebody on the line to take your call. We'll be back in a few minutes. We're back. Now we have a question from our studio audience, and so we'll turn to Jan Stone.
My question is, when counties or localities are predominantly one ethnic or racial group, and there's little contact with diverse audiences or diverse groups, what can be done to encourage intercultural or interracial understanding and to change attitudes?
Okay, that's a very serious question, and one that we all face, I'm sure. So who wants to start out with that?
One thing that we do within the Iowa Civil Rights Commission, we try and bring educational programs to various communities in Iowa. A lot of times we use tapes and films just to heighten someone's sensitivity towards the diversity in the population. Also, the 1980 census, I believe, reveals that in every Iowa county there is some diversity. As far as towns, I can't speak to that, but I think it's more than likely if people want to make an effort to try and reach out to different types of people, it can be done. And I just think that a lot of people just have to take the initiative to reach out. And there are some ways that we can go into communities, and at least the Iowa Civil Rights Commission, and I assume Iowa State University staff, can go into the various communities and talk about diversity and how that enriches one's society. So I think there are some things that can be done that exposes people. Just because you don't have someone per se living in your community, that is not that's not an excuse. There are other affirmative measures that can be taken.
Disabled, I think this is probably easier throughout the state to find disabled groups that would be more than willing to assist and to contact. You can find them anywhere in the state, and I think with the population growing older and becoming more elderly, as we know that's going to be happening, you are going to become more aware of the disabilities and some disabilities in the populations. But I think a lot of times people are excluded from it because of accessibility, but for other reasons, not seeing that people really care for them there. We've talked about a little bit about the manifestation of not belonging in many communities, the feeling that's always given there. Anytime you have inaccessibility areas, you're really telling people we don't want you around our community, we don't want you participating in it. I don't think it's just for disability, I think it's for minorities and other things too. So I think it's an attitude that's exuded from just the coldness of an environment.
I think Jan has an interesting perspective in that she felt, and you can probably articulate this a lot better than I can, that she could go into a community and feel hostility. And she said normally those were the communities that were suffering economically. And you might want to elaborate.
Definitely. The worst responses to me in the small towns were from the ones with boarded up storefronts, diminished city services, dirty streets, no activity, people not moving around. The most pleasant, cheerful response would be from the upbeat, snapping, clean, energetic community, people popping their heads in the vehicle to say, oh, hi, what's this all about? What are you doing here? Well, welcome to town. And that clearly proved to me that all of us competing for economic development, lottery funds, the whole word, 'cause money isn't going to make the difference. People's responses to people are what makes the difference. And we've got to respond to people of differences, because this is what the governor's State of the Union address said. More people are moving back to Iowa. More minorities are moving into Iowa, and more people are moving around in Iowa. Pretty soon, if we grow and prosper, we're not going to know everybody in our small towns like we have been. And it all depends on us.
Okay. I think that the question from Jan Stone points up to all of us that we have a responsibility to do some creative programming in order to help people to understand some of the diversity and some of the differences. And if we really think about that, there are ways that we can build that in to the other kinds of things that we do. Just having a program on diversity is probably not going to get a very large audience. But if you can build something in to what you're already planning to do that would help to focus on diversity, I think that's a very reasonable way to approach that. I see we have another studio question, so we'll turn to Virginia Molgard.
I've become aware from some interviews that I've done of minority youth and minority parents that many of the concepts that we teach in our parenting classes are not necessarily very well accepted or popular among some minority groups. Is this discrimination? And if it is, what can we do about it?
Virginia, will you give us an example of a concept that you've discovered is not as well accepted?
Concepts like a very democratic system in which we encourage parents to listen to the children and get input from their teenagers. In some families where that's just not the way you do things.
Okay.
I don't find that discriminatory. I think you probably have some white families that also don't accept that. So I don't say necessarily modify the program because some don't find it acceptable.
But
There's
it's an-
nothing
it's-
unique about minorities and not accepting that.
But we're talking about a cultural unawareness that some. Now,
Is
I
that
would
cultural?
never run my family of 8 children like some of my friends have managed their families. I still benefit from the classes and the reading of how to be a better parent. I select and pick out what is pertinent to me, the kind of family I want. In this case, we're talking about where the parents don't have the language skills to be able to pick out what they want from the parenting classes, but the kids are, and they're kind of using a cultural unawareness. Is that what you're sort of talking about?
No, I'm not talking about skills. I'm talking about an attitudinal difference.
Okay.
Well, can I respond? I guess my question is, who determines what's good parenting?
Right. That's
Okay.
the question.
Right. Is it white Anglo-Saxon mores? You have different cultures, and different cultures have a different living experience, an environment. And I am not going to tell someone how to parent or how to be a good parent. And I think you get into this whole society of, at one time, there was a group of people who've decided this is the best way to do things. And you are imposing your judgment. And I think you have to be very aware of when you talk about good parenting and when you're dealing with different types of people, that they just might not operate in that manner. And it's, and hopefully you will not view that as a negative. It's something that you may share with someone, and if they reject it, then they reject it. But I don't think we should impose our values on someone because we think it's the right thing to do, because who are we? And I think as we're in a very global economy right now. When we talk about minorities, if you really think about it, minorities are not minorities in the global economy. People of color are in the majority. And I think sometimes we get very contained within our own little world within the United States, North America. And so we have to really be careful when we impose values and judgments on people.
Okay. Thank you, Inga. We have another question from our studio audience. Roy Hogden.
My question relates to religious discrimination. When Extension is involved with programs that involve invocations, prayers, songs, hymns, and that type of thing, what considerations do we need to be aware of when we're involved in those programs as well?
Everybody keeps looking at me. That's a good question. As a group that plans conferences and meetings, it's a tough question because technically, at least the Iowa Civil Rights Act, you should not engage in religious discrimination. I guess a lot of times when I'm involved with groups, we try and ensure that if we're going to have prayers and invocations, first of all, you have to determine, is that needed? Some groups feel it is needed, okay? If it is needed, then you may want to try and diversify the types of invocations that you have, because more than likely you're just not going to have Christians attending your conference, especially when we're talking about programs through Iowa State University. It's an issue that I think groups have to grapple with. You know, first of all, you know, do you want an invocation or a benediction? Is that necessary? Some people believe it is. I mean, they have invocations that start off the General Assembly in our Iowa State Legislature. So it's a personal choice, but I guess I would just add that you have to be sensitive to your audience, and hopefully you're not proposing or advocating one religious belief. Also, you can have an interdenominational type of where maybe there's a generic type of invocation where you don't get too specific. So that's
Okay.
my suggestion.
Okay. Don, you have
Yeah,
a,
we have an awards banquet each year. I know Inga's attended and things, and what we've done is we've tried to do an interdenominational invocation and what have you. One of the things we've tried to encompass, though, to show you if we're still talking about subtle discrimination, is that many times people, when they go to pray, will say, please stand, which leaves out a large number of physically disabled persons who cannot do this. So what we've done is we've put in a little disclaimer in the beginning of the program that says some people, everyone remains seated during this because then everyone can have an equal posture, and it's on the prayer, this type of thing. But it's one of those traditional types of things that is usually overlooking the diversity of people or the disabled persons.
Yeah.
So
thank you for making that point. We have, Charles? You had nothing to,
It's a very difficult question. You have the separation of church and state, and I think you've had the issues here of the baccalaureate services at graduation with American Civil Liberties Union. I think it's a very complicated question. I think the best thing to do is to make it as non-denominational as possible.
and as inclusive as possible. Yeah, okay. Another question from our studio audience, which I'll share with you. Where do our supervisors and managers receive training to help combat subtle discrimination in themselves, their staff, and in the office environment?
You asking me?
I'm looking right at you, Charles.
Well, we've done it different ways over the last 15 years. We have met with the department heads. We have conducted some training sessions with Extension Service at various regions. We talk to classes. We are willing to meet with anyone who wishes to meet. So over a period of time, we have, I think, met with most departments. But we have a lot of new people, and therefore we don't always get that. If you have a conference, in all probability, their schedules will not permit all people to attend, so we meet them as we can. But we're virtually in contact with screening committees, with departmental chairs, and with others throughout the university on a daily basis. So we're answering specific questions, but routine training programs, we don't have those at this point.
And I guess it seems to me that there are a couple of things that we could think about there. On campus, I think Sharon Drake's office can help to set up some of those kinds of experiences, and perhaps even off campus. But certainly our own program leaders, area extension directors are responsible for planning the kind of in-service education that would help to alleviate some of the kinds of things that we have identified as subtle discrimination. If anybody feels a particular need for that, they need to be in touch with their supervisors so that we can respond to that need with a specially planned in-service education.
We have put out a manual, affirmative action manual, which explains some of the things that you should do and possibly should not do. We've also included in that a list of the most commonly asked questions.
All right.
So we, at other times, we put out special monograms of sexual harassment. We put out those on recruitment procedures, questions you probably should avoid. So we do different booklets that we send out to departmental chairs.
I just had an interview with an interesting question. How are you going to handle your family responsibilities, ma'am, if we should hire you? And I thought, gee, that's no.
Yeah.
But that's a question we say avoid.
Yeah, avoid is
Yes.
right.
one of the things I might indicate is that, and I'm sure Inga does some educational types of things when called upon too, but many of the state agencies and The Commission on Persons with Disabilities is in the newly formed, after 1986, Department of Human Rights. But then we have the Commission on Status of Blacks, Commission of Spanish-Speaking Peoples, Commission of Women. I think any of these groups, if you call that, would say, yes, there are some issues that we need to do, and would tailor a program for anyone who would want to call something like that, or call Inga's office or our office, and we could refer them to whomever, depending on the type of program. I think the only way you can really encounter it or get rid of it is to really educate people, and I think that's what everybody's really about.
Okay, fine, thank you. I have a question here in regard to search committees and selection committees, which I think may be appropriate. Most well-meaning selection committees find it difficult not to be influenced by assumptions based on sex and race. What can the committees do to ensure that these assumptions don't interfere with the selection process? Charles?
Well, I'm assuming that you have a diversity of members on those committees and that the whole committee is not governed by what one or two people happen to feel. It is a difficult thing to deal with. I think on some occasions we hear the complaint that we don't know who the minorities are, or we don't know who the women are. And then you have a pool and you tell them here are the women and here are the minorities. Then all of a sudden you get the question, well, do we have to hire them because they're women or minorities? So I think those are the kinds of attitudes that you have on the committee, but I think that hopefully we will overcome some of that with our administration at the present. I think that we are finding that there are qualified women and minorities, and I think that the best way to look at it is look at the application, look at the person's credentials, and forget about the other aspect of that individual. And when you come to a point where the persons are substantially the same, it is our position that you hire the person that's least represented, because it's no longer an issue of the better qualified.
Okay.
So I don't know how you would deal with that one individual on it. I think that's up to the rest of the committee as to whether it's going to be swayed by the views of one or two people.
Well, I think we're also in a time, as you've mentioned, where any search committee that's formed on campus, at least, gets some very direct message about the need to have a pool, a diverse pool, and the need to not screen that pool to the point that you're using a set of criteria that automatically excludes women, minorities, whatever. So I think that all of us are being made more aware, and certainly all of us also have the responsibility to be on the alert for the kinds of subtle discrimination that can happen.
Yeah, I guess one of the, controversial issues that we're seeing, at least in the academic community, is, and no one has mentioned it as of yet, is affirmative action. And what does that imply in our academic setting? I know that the Regents institutions have adopted affirmative action plan, and from what I understand, the Regents institutions are very committed to that. So is Governor Branstad. And he is so committed to that his department directors at we meet with him every month, and every quarter we discuss what affirmative action we have taken within our respective departments. So that is a firm commitment. But what I would like, I guess, to impart and communicate is that when people think of affirmative action, they immediately leap to less qualified. And I think Charles specifically stated that when we talk about affirmative action, we are talking about qualified individuals. And then you make that effort then to go the extra step to diversify.
Okay.
And so I just want to reiterate that we're talking about qualified people.
Yeah, that's right. We have another question from the studio audience. We'll turn to Tom Glanville. Tom Greiner.
Tom and I have a lot of trouble with that. We have offices side by side and we have similar interests, so certainly that's an easy mistake to make and often made. One of the things that we talk about subtle discrimination would be talking about humor or attempts at humor. And I think many times as we do extension meetings, we do like to bring some humor into those meetings. We like to do something to liven the audience up. And yet many times I think it's possible to make a joke that doesn't come off right and to use the jokes think most of us are avoiding the "my wife did this" or "the women did this." But sometimes if you're in an ethnic community, you'll use some nationality groups or use jokes like that. I wonder if you could comment on that, any of you, how you see those and the place of humor, or if there is a place for any of these type jokes.
That's a
I
tough
think
one.
you should know your audience when you start telling jokes. I don't think you should tell Polish jokes to blacks, because blacks will feel that it will not be a Polish joke the next time you tell it. No one expects work environment to be so staid that there's never any time for fun. And most of the laws don't deal with isolated situations. But it does not mean that each time you come, you have to have a joke. So I think it depends upon what the rapport is with the committee, with that group, as to how you respond. I would say it's probably unwise to tell racial jokes in an environment where you don't understand your audience.
You'll never know everybody in your audience unless you grew up in that town. I think you should avoid ethnic groups, jokes and sexist jokes of any kind ever. Now, can you imagine people coming in the Fair Housing Awareness Vehicle with Iowa civil rights all over it and telling me racist jokes? And I'd say, sir, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to hear this. Please stop talking. Oh, this is just a really funny one. I don't want to hear it. Stop. And to force this joke on me was just offensive, irritating, totally, and stupid. I always wanted to turn names in, but I never did.
I guess I answered it from what I think is a legal point. It depends upon how often this is done and what effect it has upon the people. If everybody enjoys it and everybody participates, it may not be illegal. But I think in most cases, is it the proper thing to do in a work environment? I think that's what you need to consider.
I want to take it, I guess, a step further. I guess my question is, why do we need to make fun or place people or genders or in a humorous vein? Why do we have to make fun of people? I mean, I think there are probably enough jokes around that we don't have to engage in singling out specific people to make fun of. And that's my approach. And I hear a lot of times, well, I've told a Polish joke to a Polish audience and they liked it, so I assume I could tell it anywhere. Well, just because one person or two people may like the joke doesn't mean everybody else is. And I just don't see the need to tell ethnic or sex jokes or racist jokes. I just don't see the need for it personally.
Or handicapped.
Or handicapped.
Or
That's
limited.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
and I guess I was going to reiterate that same point, is that there's no problem with humor to begin a meeting
Yeah.
or something
No.
like this, but there's all sorts of ways to do humor types of things. What traditionally has been with the ethnic jokes and those that you can translate anybody you want, you can put any group of people in there, has been to keep those people in their place. And it's a way of forcing people to make them uncomfortable. The person that told the joke, racist jokes to the person from civil rights, is doing that for a specific reason, to get even, this type of thing. So there's a motive behind it and what they were used for. There's been a lot of studies done on this type of humor and why it's being used that way. I suspect that there's another way to get humor, and you can get humor into it without picking on groups to keep them in their place. And I use that in quotes.
I think that's an important point. One of the most interesting meetings that I've been to in recent months was one that dealt with how to use humor in crisis situations. So there is a place for humor in what we do, but it needs to be
Especially in state
the
government.
right humor. Yeah. I have another question from Southwest Iowa, which I'd like to share. When making personal invitations to protected clientele, how can we justify that the only reason these persons receive personal invitations is because of their minority status within the community?
Well, if you normally had them there, you wouldn't need to send them a special invitation. The fact that you're sending it is because you haven't had them. And that in itself justifies it. That's what you call affirmative action.
I guess one of the questions that I think we need to answer is, who are we justifying it to? Ourselves, or to the people who are being invited? We're doing it because the law requires it.
That shouldn't be the reason only. It should be done because it's the right thing to do.
All right.
And
Have something to give
consequently,
to me.
when you ask them to come, you're saying, we have been unable to reach you through the general announcements, and we're making a
Okay.
special effort. If someone is trying to sell you something and you don't respond, they send you a personal invitation. To whom are they justifying? So I don't think a justification
all
is
right.
needed to either party.
Okay, okay. Anything else? I have another one here, which is in regard to affirmative action in the hiring process. Regarding selecting the candidate from the less well-represented group when presented with equally qualified people, isn't that discriminating against a person because they are a member of a group that is more well-represented? Why not flip a coin?
Well, we can get into a philosophical debate about why we have affirmative action. I think if we look at our society, there is no doubt that we've had systemic discrimination within our society that has resulted in the exclusion of women and people of color in the public sector and the private sector. I mean, it's there. I think that we can look at the employment figures, we can look at the disparities in salaries. I mean, there are indicators that show that there has been pervasive discrimination within our society. So affirmative action, I see, and this is my personal belief, and we're getting into philosophies here, is that affirmative action is a way to remedy our past, and it's a way to ensure that we have a more diversified workplace or whatever situation that we're talking about. Sure, it may be using gender and race as a plus, but our U.S. Supreme Court has held that in certain situations that is legal. And it's very technical, but it is legal. It is something that society is allowed to do. And I think we have to make our workforce, at least, more representative, and that's a means to do that. So that's a personal type of philosophy.
Can I? In housing, so you collect applications, you check references on 10 people. 5 of them are clearly undesirable sub-applicants. You just don't want to even consider them. 5 of them, so. And you come down to 3 that are equally acceptable, desirable tenants. How are you going to pick the one of those 3? We recommend that they make a list of tenant selection priorities. What is most important? Non-protected characteristics. And then you use the same list all the time when you run into this situation. So that if you are eliminating the female or the black or the handicapped, you're not eliminating them because of their protected status. You are eliminating them because you always take the non-smoker over the smoker, or you take the better income over the lesser income, better ability to pay. If the employment would make priorities for each job, one job might require more typing, better public speaking, better management skills. Then you're picking the person with that particular qualification and not the protected list.
Statistically speaking, if you were hiring by chance, your workforce should mirror the population from which you recruit. That means it would not be all female, it would not be all male, it would not be all one race. So the mere fact that it is all of those means that you are not hiring statistically. And that's what affirmative action is designed to do. So when you find 3 candidates who are substantially the same, and you have a total of a workforce which is all of one group or one sex, then it is required and expected that you would hire the group that's least represented, because all of them are substantially the same. So why would you flip a coin when the coin evidently has already been flipped before, the reason you have the makeup that you currently have?
Okay. I think that helps to put the employment question in perspective, and we have the philosophy, and we also have the law, which is operating as we make those kinds of decisions. Our time is just about up, and I want to say a thank you to our panelists, Jan Alderton, Inga Bunbury Langston, Don Westergaard, and Charles Samuels. I also want to say thank you to our studio audience. And to all of you from around the state who participated this morning. Your questions helped us to focus on issues that were important to you, and your interest in sharing your questions with us is greatly appreciated. This program today was designed to increase our understanding, our knowledge, and our actions in regard to subtle discrimination. I hope that as you go about your work in the coming program year, the kinds of things that we've talked about this morning will be on your mind. Thank you much for joining us. I'm Betty Elliott.